good to go. Oh,
You think I should record to the cloud, or I think or record to,
yeah. I've only used Zoom once. I normally use Teams, and I can't remember what I chose to do. I think I went to the cloud just because I felt that that would circumvent any restrictions on kind of recording quality anyone. I don't think it makes a difference, though, to be honest.
okay,
Yeah.
fantastic. So
Hey, and can I just clarify the mapping of IP, just to make sure I know kind of what you mean with that, or I could just ask when you do it.
yeah, but what are you thinking? I mean, let me see what I have on mapping, okay?
Okay.
Let's see.
I
Example.
guess mapping means, well, in fact,
No, no,
just
I
tell me
know.
what you think it means.
Yeah, no, was there a question about mapping that we were.
Yeah, so you had a question for was mapping of IP, what we do and how we can easily use Intanify.
All right, okay. Wow, I don't see that question anymore. I may have, you know what? I may have deleted this question
Alrighty.
because I thought it wasn't a clear question because
Mm,
people don't understand what mapping is.
yeah.
So
It's kind of an important one actually. So the way I understood it was like, how do you actually associate individual intangible assets with value? Is that what you saw it as or not? Maybe that's just not clear.
maybe at the end of the process, yes, but to begin with,
Yeah.
I'm looking at the process where, we speak to the founders and we have just how they would use Intanify. They would speak to us,
Mm,
meet one of our patent attorneys, and then they would describe the system, describe the processes. And then we would say, oh, there's an algorithm here that they use. Oh, and there's this methodology here. So
yeah.
this is when they end up with an innovation catalog and suddenly they have all this bunch of assets, then
Mm,
process behind it is the mapping, our process. And
okay.
I guess Intanify probably does some kind of mapping, right? Because
Yeah.
it just reflects the assets in a list form or in a.
Yeah, okay, cool. So I understand. So it is a bit different. Okay, so maybe let's skip that question because I think the way that it'll come out will just come out in a nutshell in the questions. And then just to clarify, so probably I should have done this before we started recording, but I guess I'll just go nowhere.
No, don't worry
So
about it.
so in my email I said so question 5 where you asked there's specific examples where it significantly impacts valuation. You can't do that just yet. And arguably you probably might not be able to do that in the future just because of confidentiality. But right now, we've been used in a bunch of Series A and Series B fundraisings, and there will be that, but not kind of right now. But I'll be able to speak to that when you ask like how it would kind of work. And then number 8 about private equity, that's kind of quite technical, and I don't think will be interesting to most people. It's a good question though. And happy to
Okay,
talk about it with
we
you,
have
but
experience with private equity houses. Okay, no
yeah.
worries.
Mm. Part of
Yeah.
the answer is that private equity people think that they're so smart that there's nothing that they could learn. That's the real reason, to be totally honest. And for the better ones, it's actually true because they effectively do what we do. They just have cash flow statements almost per asset, like that kind of granular, which ends up being, effectively kind of what we do. But most just say, well, there's nothing you could tell me. I know everything.
Excellent. Okay.
Cool.
So
All right.
you don't have to worry because I will end up using a small part of
Yeah.
what you do, and it'll be great. Don't worry. And if you don't want to answer something, tell me. I'm not answering this. Let's move
No,
on.
no,
So
no, no, cool. I'm good. I'm good. And I really like the questions. So okay.
okay, great. So let's start from your experience as a CFO because lately I've been thinking about CFOs and how they don't have tools to talk about value. They have the
Mm,
numbers, the financials, they have the fundamentals, and they have all these lines with costs. And IP a lot of the time goes into the cost. So
mm,
maybe tell us a little bit about your experience as a CFO and how that. I remember you telling me that it led you to understand, what the value of a platform like Intanify could be. So could you
mm.
tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, even it led me effectively to found the business. So maybe taking a little bit even more of a step back, I started life as an investment banker, and I was really mostly in real assets. So it was businesses like energy, manufacturing, mining, where at the end of the day, the only thing that matters for value is cash flow. And anybody who knows what they're talking about, that's really all that matters. But no matter what business you are, the way you make your cash flow is typically from assets. So the way we would always have a narrative if it was an M&A transaction or so on, you would talk about the pieces of your business and how they come together and therefore how they make your cash flow work. So if it was an oil company, and oil is a good example because you would think it is the opposite of the software business, but you have oil fields, you have a pipeline network, you have a refinery, you have distribution, and all of those together kind of create the cash flow. When I became a CFO, kind of really in the second half of my career after I'd been a banker, I was CFO of a functional beverage startup, highly innovative company, had incredible assets, but these assets were proprietary recipes, they were brand, they were these types of things. We actually, by design of the business model, had zero assets that were owned. And what that meant was we had nothing on the balance sheet at all. And I felt that as a CFO, I was flying blind. Like clearly, cash flow was the only thing that mattered, but wasn't making correct decisions around insuring. Like, did I have everything insured? Without that kind of list, you don't necessarily have the checklist of things to go against. Were we always describing our business holistically? So if you're going to talk about your business, one hand is certainly your income statement and the way that you earn money, but it's almost the other side of the coin to say, these are the assets that we have. And you might do that. You probably, don't always get everything every time you do that. And then even down to things like financing. Now, it's not always easy to use non-physical assets as collateral, but it is important to present that to lenders who may not always be cookie cutter lenders. And again, didn't have that. So as a CFO, I felt really that I didn't have kind of all the information that I needed. And being a banker and somebody who studied accounting by background, I did understand why that was the case. Except I didn't really accept that. And I thought just because accounting standard setters have not kept up, and just because accountants, and it's a very important role as well, and the methodology is important for certain reasons, just because there wasn't a serial number and you couldn't kick it, and those were the criteria for calling it an asset, it didn't mean that you could just sweep it under the carpet and just say, well, we're not going to have anything here.
So what made you realize there must be a way? I mean, were you saying to
Yeah,
myself that there must be a way where
yeah.
we can reflect these assets? So how was that for you?
Yeah, pretty much. So I kind of knew what they were. And because there wasn't a protocol for doing that, that ended up just being analysis, back of the envelope, writing things down, and then presenting those kind of as it came up. Not everybody necessarily has the same backgrounds. Not everybody necessarily has the time to kind of go through that process. So the question I asked myself is whether there was a repeatable, scalable way of doing that. And I didn't know the answer to that. I just thought that, it's really not actually that complicated a problem if you think of all the incredible technologies in the world. Like that's, far from rocket science. So that was kind of the beginning of the Intanify journey was really understanding what the technological solutions to that could be. And I'm not a technological person, so I had to, to get a good co-founder to do that. But it was really just that question and not acceptance that kind of led me to look for a better way of doing that.
So I bet you there are a few CFOs that work for technology companies that would very much want to hear, what is it that they're missing that someone like you could tell them, here you go.
Mm.
There's a lot of technology in your
Yeah.
company, and there's a lot you can do to communicate that. So
Mm.
let's say um, let's say I'm a CFO and my client, I could be a corporate lawyer as well, right? And my clients are preparing for the next round. So how can Intanify help a corporate lawyer or a CFO?
Maybe let's see them differently because they are kind of slightly different personas. It's interesting, CFOs, I initially, having had a lot of experience with accountants, I thought that they would be quite against this, but they are actually really the most curious about this. And I learned partly that's because there's a massive debate in the accounting community as to how to attack this. But CFOs are generally very curious. And the way I normally explain that is you have plant, property, and equipment on your balance sheet, or you don't, because that's really unimportant to you. But for your business, and it'll depend on the business, you should probably have data, code, brand, or whatever kind of the equivalent might be. So the way I describe Intanify, and without going into the technicalities of how we do that, is just to say we produce something that looks a lot like the balance sheet, but in that format, in a way that kind of makes sense from that perspective. So what are they missing? It depends on the business. It's for tech businesses, which I know is where we're both generally focused. It's certainly the most widespread one is trade secrets. That's all businesses are kind of missing those, but then it will depend. So we're working with a very impressive Series B data company today. That's 60-70% of their total asset base is in data. And that wouldn't be a surprise to them. What is useful to them is actually to have that inventory and say, so we have like a thing we call the value map, which breaks down your entire asset base across categories and within categories, through to assets. Exactly how much of that was the proprietary data, but then of that 60%, what is kind of the biggest piece of that? And then, software code, which is, we differentiate between software solution, which is not proprietary, which is not copyright, and then copyright, which is your secret sauce and what is actually protectable. Brand is always interesting. A lot of people might be cynical about brand, but what you'll see from banks that do lend against these things is that is mostly what they collateralize, partly because it's easier to collateralize, but also because it does have real value. Because if you're in a competitive market, that is something your competitors will often get. So what are CFOs missing? It's literally that list, that asset register that at the moment, all they have is, cash on one side and equity on the other side of the balance sheet. It's really filling in for what a modern company really should be looking at.
Excellent.
For corporate lawyers, I guess, and also for acquirers, I would say what you're missing is, again, that inventory, that register. The values matter a little bit less, as opposed to is everything there. And what we hear from advisors, everybody from insurers through quite large companies, is that when asked for that list, almost no company actually has it. And it's something that shouldn't be just drawn up anyway, just before kind of a transaction. It should be something that, should arguably be on every board meeting agenda. Like, what have we got? What has changed? What have we decided not to protect? What have we actually invested in protecting? What were the returns to doing that? So for an M&A lawyer, I think that list is a very important and crucial part of the VDR. Of just what is there, both registered, which is a bit easier, and that's kind of always there. But then, all the trade secrets, and then, the diligence might be what are the processes around actually protecting those, and how do I know that if we buy this business, things are actually going to remain the way that they are. So everything really comes from that initial list, and then there's a lot that kind of comes from that.
So for M&A lawyers and for CFOs, actually what Intanify is, I'm actually showing you, fleshing out your assets, and I'm giving you them on a list. So when you talk about your assets, you're going to be able to present them in a much better way that you may have not thought about them.
Absolutely, and it's interesting. The list that we produce, and we can talk about how we do that. Is not necessarily, you shouldn't be surprised anything you see there. But if you're a company, and we've just done one recently with quite a large tech company, and we produced 90 assets there. And firstly, we're always 98%, 99%, right. There's nothing that kind of shouldn't be there. But what it'll normally do is it won't get everything, because it reads your technical documentation, it reads investor decks, board packs, this type of thing, and it really just synthesizes things that hadn't been written down yet. What it normally does as well, because not everything was there, is that it promotes the discussion of That's brilliant, but actually that thing is two things, because we know that like how that works. And now that I see that 80%, the 20% that's missing is extremely clear. So I did it just yesterday with the company, and it took an hour. And this is a relatively smaller company, but we produced, call it, there's about 50 assets, and in an hour we had 60, and it was, you know, very extensive. So that's what we produce. That's almost the starting point, though. The value layer on top of that allows it to just be visualized really clearly. So we map that to revenues, because at the end of the day, you know, as a company, how you make money. And then you also, the company, you know what's important to you being able to do that. So if you're a SaaS company, you probably have a specific, you know, 2-3 specific data pools that are important to producing what you produce. There's probably some secret sauce. In our case, it would be like the inference engine. And that ties all together. So you can actually visualize in relatively simple charts like Sankey diagrams and so on, how I make money, what I have, how they link together. So it really brings to life, you know, what your business does in a way that was not really possible. And actually had a bunch of McKinsey people come and do it. And then, you know, they could always do that for sure. It would just
Right.
cost
So,
100
so if
grand.
I'm
Yeah.
if I'm a startup, we're a team of 10.
Yeah.
We've already passed the first round. We're heading to seed, maybe. Yeah, say we're before seed. We upload a bunch of our materials and decks into Intanify, and
Mm.
what happens is we get an output of of our assets, and that's kind of like the first step where we use it to, you know, to tell our story. I mean,
Yeah.
how does it usually work? I mean, I bet the reactions from people when they see the output, they're really excited because suddenly they see all these assets that they didn't even know existed,
Mm.
right?
Mm. Yeah, pretty much. And you know what? They kind of did know it existed. They just hadn't had everything articulated in a formal way like that. And it wouldn't be easy just to sit down and write that list, even if when you see the list, nothing is necessarily surprising. Okay, so taking maybe just take a step back and explain kind of like how our tech actually works, is that when I came to looking to see what the tech solution could be to this, I found out, you know, so no surprise, there is no data on these types of assets. You know, otherwise, frankly, there wouldn't have been a business opportunity, or there would have been, you know, 200 startups already having nailed it. The state of the art is a patent attorney or a consultant doing an IP audit. And what that typically looks like is, you know, a relatively expensive professional coming into your office, spending a bunch of time with your engineers, with your commercial people, and so on and so forth. Probably going through a lot of documentation, asking, you know, often similar questions, because particularly if it's, you know, we're going to talk about software and tech businesses, there is almost a checklist that they would kind of run from, and then they would synthesize all of that, and then they would effectively write this list. Always with the list comes a lot of advice, because if you never had the list before, you probably also hadn't thought of, you know, risks and shortcomings and those types of things. So when we built the business, that was the status quo, is these IP audits, which are disruptive, expensive, something that happened probably only once in a while, should be almost done. So the way the tech works is it uses symbolic AI in kind of the very original AI, I would have called an expert system, where we worked with some relatively large firms, and we built knowledge graphs with them. Worked with an academic called Victor Dörfler, who's an AI professor, and we locked one professional at a time in a room with him for about 4 days. Very searching process. You were kind of almost reaching to their brains and so how do you break that up? And if they said this, but this was like this, then, and it's like an empty word processor, and a
Right.
three-dimensional decision tree would open up. So what happens from a business's perspective is they start off by answering questions. Looks and feels a lot like a questionnaire. It's actually determinative for exactly that reason, that the scales and so on extra. It's quite educational. In every case, we've had businesses, you know, like rapidly writing things down, because if you hadn't been asked that before, you know, you probably hadn't got everything in order. So that takes 35 minutes to an hour. An hour is kind of like quite a big business, like a 30-40 million revenue business. And then that's processed to about 12,000 decision rules, which is effectively the same thing as a patent attorney having gathered a lot of context and having reasoned through it and having understood your business. That context, yeah.
Are you saying that it takes 1 hour? to kind of gather the materials before there is an output on the assets?
That's 35 minutes to 1 hour, so it can be quite a lot short if you're a smaller business. So that 10 person business seed stage is on the smaller end of what you would normally do. That would be kind of 35 minutes. A lot of those things are just not even done yet, right?
Okay.
So do that. It's normally an enjoyable process. We were very kind of sensitive when we started off with not making it too laborious and whatever, but every business actually really enjoyed that process. That's done. It gathers the context, the model having effectively applied a digital patent attorney's and IP solicitor's mind, then reads documents. So you upload documents which are can either be quite public, so technical blogs, pitch decks, product brochures, that type of thing. Or if you want a more extensive audit and perhaps less kind of secretive, it can be like everything down to database schema, like internal products, SOPs, and this type of thing. And the system reads all of those documents in a way that a patent attorney might have, but that would have taken a very long time because we do 150 documents in one case.
Right.
And out of that process comes the list of assets, which is what a professional might have done, but given a reasonable budget of thousands of pounds type of thing, there would have been your 15 ready standout assets rather than 150 extensive authoritative type of asset.
Fantastic. And then you enable the IP practitioner to do less of this tiring work and more strategic work.
Well, that's it. So, so that report that I mentioned, which in the UK there's an IPO kind of standard for this, is you would get a 30-page report out of that, would say this is what you have, and given what we learned in the interviews, you said this, but you also said that I'm giving you this advice. We call it best practice because it's an AI, shouldn't be giving advice, and you get that report, which the system can do it. It can do like 90% of it. If you have a really good lawyer, pick that up, or patent attorney consultants, 2, 3, 4 things bubble up to the top immediately. And it's like, so all of that kind of dog's body work has been done. The report has been drafted. I'm really going to focus all of my time now on these 3, 4 things.
Right.
And those tend to have like massive impact. Now, if you're not a good lawyer, then you might not have been able to add kind of too much. But the people we work with are generally quite good, and that means for a company you get a lot of impact. Because in the first case, you're getting a much more holistic view of your own business. You're getting all of the standard advice anyway, but then you're getting, and there's a case study we can talk of, some really high impact stuff, which will probably increase value and importantly, decrease risk kind of quite a lot. So more interesting work for the advisor as well, I think.
And what about if I'm a founder and I don't have an IP attorney? Can I use Intanify without having a corporate lawyer or an IP lawyer with me?
Absolutely, and that's probably 4 out of 5 times what we're doing now. Because if you're a youngish company, so I should say that it really does help if you're a little bit further along the line. Because if you're frankly at our stage, nothing matters other than product market fit, and any IP that you think you have, you probably counted chickens before it hatch. So really, you should have hundreds of thousands, probably 2 million is probably a good start kind of ARR, and then you can start to kind of focus on these things kind of a little bit. So if you're a younger business, like a million or 500 grand revenue, then most of that is going to be very helpful, and almost all of it you didn't know. So you probably didn't need a highly trained professional, such as yourself, to have kind of gone through that. You would already get kind of a huge amount of the benefits. Then when you get those recommendations, there are going to be certain things that you might want to focus on doing. And the way the report is drafted is there's kind of like a timeline of things that emerge. And at that point, you might say, right, this trade secrets policy seems like it would make a lot of sense. Like now that we actually see our trade secrets, which we, by the way, will use as a go-to-market advertising stream, because you can actually do that outside in and say, there's all of your trade secrets, you should probably kind of protect them. So once you see them and you decide, well, actually, it's not that difficult to go ahead and protect these, but now I need the help, then you could reach out to an IP attorney, or indeed, we can kind of connect one. And then you go over the targeted things. So this is what we're trying to protect, so you do, and you proceed from there.
So for founders of, technology companies who have a lot of tech that's being developed, they don't have ARR, they have, a few contracts, they're beginning.
Mm,
Most of their potential is in, the pilots that they're having.
mm,
That would be a great use case to use Intanify, because basically, if, for example, they were approaching the Israeli Innovation Authority or the Europe
mm,
Innovation Council, and they have a chapter on IP, and they were being asked,
mm.
please describe what your IP assets were, then
Yeah,
using Intanify could be a great place to start, because they could very quickly, with not that much resources, they could just get this output of all these assets that they have without even going to a corporate attorney or an IP
yeah,
attorney.
yeah. That's exactly it. And that's kind of almost our entry product, is just that discovery and that audit. For a very young company that doesn't have revenue, value starts to be a little bit hypothetical. So it probably doesn't really make that much sense to take that step, which is a slightly more expensive product from us. But that is a really, really good start, because also if you're a young company and it's not a big process, that's the right time to make many of these decisions. I mean, as you know, right? Things like registering trademarks, really not expensive, and it becomes a little bit more difficult kind of later. And just setting up certain processes much easier when you 10 people, very tech focused, than later on. And that's typically what companies do. They say, oh, well, we'll figure this all out later, because it feels, and to be honest, maybe it is an expensive, big process, because if you do get in a big firm, probably that is what it'll be. But it doesn't need to be that. It can be kind of like initial step. And for a lot of those types of questions of what IP do you have, it's incredible when you speak to also very experienced, educated people about IP. They just say, "Oh, I don't have a patent." And if they a little bit more versed in these things, they'll say, "I don't have a patent or trademark." But it's as you know, like a whole lot more than that. And if you are able to submit that information, particularly to investors, and say, so this is what we have. And you can now, start to speak about the nuts and bolts of, again, assets, their assets. This is the way I make my money. This is the way I protect myself. This is how I'm very different. That's a big differentiator to someone else who's just got a hockey stick chart. And it's also probably quite a powerful signal, I think, to investors that at the end of the day, you're now going to be custodians of their capital. If you're actually able
Absolutely.
to have your arms around all those things, and then to be able to talk about the steps that you're taking, even if they're not expensive, even if the steps are over the next 2 years, but a plan around that. We've seen that investors, get quite a lot of comfort from that, as arguably they should do.
Excellent. So
Mm.
so founders with companies not having revenues, but say, for example, they're going for their A round
Yeah.
without ARR, are a classic example for founders that can use Intanify and enjoy the list of assets that they get, right?
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say classic. I'd say that definitely works. So I guess what we're talking about there is quite a deep tech business, because if you're going to A with no money, certainly
Yeah,
you won't be able to do that.
yeah,
Then it's all the more important to be able to kind of, produce that list, because you actually don't have anything else almost to show. It's also extremely powerful if you do have 2 or 10 million ARR, and then you're also able to kind of articulate how it is that you protect that. So we talk about moats, and particularly at that stage, moats is very important. And a moat tends to be a bit of an arm wavy, imprecise discussion. But if you're able to say, so our moats are two things. We have data that is irreplaceable.
yeah.
It's difficult to replicate for these reasons. It's powerful for these, and this is how we use it. And by the way, here's the list of them. Boom, 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 boom.
Exactly.
And you're able to produce a slide like that. It makes it more powerful. ARI doesn't get you kind of the whole way type of thing. Now, with that, you can also be a little bit more precise about valuation, because if you don't have cash flow, then it's an exercise in painting the future. If you do have a fair amount of revenue, then you can actually talk about the valuation as of kind of your last set of ARR.
Excellent. So what do you think are the most common types of intangible assets that companies don't account for? You mentioned trade secrets,
Yeah.
and you mentioned data. So I'm imagining these are the two big ones. From
Mm.
from my experience, I'm wondering, is that are these the big two?
Yeah. So I think the answer to that is because almost no companies account for this at all. It's everything really. So the question becomes, what is the biggest drop ball in a way? Because if you're not counting anything, then some things that you're not counting are more important than others. So, and it really then depends on the business. So if you are a company like we've worked with recently that's got this, the world's largest data set on a particular medical condition, and it's been gathered over 20 years. So it's longitudinal, it's very extensive, and it's very, very difficult to gather because a lot of it actually comes through using NLP to transcribe handwritten notes and this type of thing. For them, it's data, and they yeah, so for them it's data. For another company, it would be something else, for sure. And it's most often though is trade secrets, because trade secrets, I don't need to tell you, are just extremely powerful and extremely unknown really, because trade secrets are really everything, including that data, but also including customer lists and everything else. And it sounds like a bit legalese, and perhaps we had one discovery user once saying he liked the sound of it because it made him feel like James Bond or something like that. But really, all it is it's your secret sauce that gives you your competitive advantage. And clearly, just by nature of capitalism, every company has got trade secrets, because every company, otherwise you wouldn't exist, or you certainly wouldn't exist for very long unless they're competitive advantage. So that is the big one. Data is kind of is the other one we see, but particularly because of the types of companies we work with.
Excellent. So
Yeah.
when managers see Intanify, they see the platform, they get this output of all their assets. They say, "Wow, we have all this data, we have all these potential trade secrets." How does it help them to talk about their assets? I mean, have you
Yeah.
experienced their experience of the platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, in the first place, this is a category creation that we're doing here because it didn't exist before. So the way that our model works is effectively making it a lot cheaper and a lot more accessible to do those services. So IP audit, but also IP due diligence is our third product, which we call Risk, which is basically what it would have been for an IP lawyer to have called all over your company and asked you all the questions, and then have produced a list of red flags, allows you to do that for yourself and see those red flags before.
Excellent. So you're helping them prepare for the due diligence, really.
Yeah, and we worked with Danson's on that, and Danson's does a lot of investor readiness for VCs, and they get called in. We'll be trading this company a year or IPOing it. Can you give it a tire kick now? And then they produce almost the to-do list of what needs to get done over kind of the next while. But that's not answer the question of so how do they use it? In the first case, it almost feels like a once-off engagement where you get given this information. What we're very excited to be doing in future is to add more and more features, that it is something that you then use on an ongoing basis. Once you do have that information, it's difficult not to have that information and not to keep it up to date, because it's all on the platform. You've now got control. You now know what you're looking after. You would kind of probably keep it up to date. It's not something you would log on to every single day, kind of clearly. But again, coming from a CFO's perspective, it should be in your monthly management accounts. I mean, the fact that it's not there but you have an empty balance sheet makes kind of zero sense. Now, the way we see it being used, and the way that this is not something that's natural to most people, that we've presented this is, I mean, most powerfully in this chart that I've described called the value map, which we've seen just being used as a dump in a slide in an investor deck, because it really answers the question of, how do we actually do this? What do we actually have that produces everything else that was in the deck type of thing? But we've also seen that used in board packs. It's like a good agenda of like, right, so as we kind of go through the business, where should we focus? What should we be talking about? What's been done? Where capital has been allocated. But then also for onboarding, normally more senior members of the team. But if you're a smaller company, probably everybody. To say, so in onboarding and describing how the company works, like here's kind of everything. So that's the one. The other one we have is we call it value driver summary, which ties your revenue streams, which is where your value comes from. Which there might only be one if you're a smaller company, but really you don't need to get too much bigger before it makes sense that it's bifurcated or in three, and how that marries to the assets that you have, because you might have some important piece of code that supports everything, and then you would see that on the chart, but you might have certain bits of know-how or certain training that is only associated with one of the value of the value drivers. So between those two things, it becomes intuitive. You don't need to be a valuation expert, and indeed most people aren't, and it's probably not even a helpful conversation to go into. And you also don't need to be an IP expert. You're an expert in your own business. You're able to say, this is what we have. This is what gives our competitive position. This is why we're powerful, and that's kind of almost the agenda.
So they see a visual map, not
Yeah.
only the assets, but the interconnections between them and how they serve the value proposition.
That's it. So the value map is number one. The value driver summary is the second one, which is in a way, it's actually the same data, but it's presented in a way that it flows from the value drivers to the assets actually that you have. And it's very pretty.
So you're actually help them not only with the inventory, but you're helping them to tell the story.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I think it wouldn't be interesting enough if it was only the list. That's the departure point, and it's very important. But to actually use that as a narrative is, we've got one step further, which is an asset graph, which takes a bit more work. But if you think about all of IP is interrelated with other IP, and you have trademarks protecting brands, you have software code that's associated with data, and we present that. Anybody technical would be familiar with graph formats, and social network would be a graph format. We do that. We call it an asset graph, which is actually showing the interconnectivity of all of your assets in nodes. And that's useful. This is definitely a level up on how Intanified you are, as it were. Helps, for example, in surfacing trade secrets that have not been protected, or things that have not necessarily been made the most of, because again, everything was in the ether, and nothing had been written down. Now, in the first case, you got it written down, but as a step further, you've actually got to visualize as to how everything kind of fits together.
Excellent. I think this is amazing value for anyone who wants to present their IP. It's a complete investment readiness package, really, that can serve as like the next steps would then be, okay, you want to protect your trade secrets, do that with an IP attorney, but it saves so many hours of mapping. What we call mapping is that we do all the interviews, and we kind of extract the information out of the founders, CTO, and what you're saying is you're able to automate a lot of these steps. Sorry, yeah. 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to repeat this because
okay.
It's
Sure. Yeah.
So what you're saying, it's an investment readiness package that not only helps you understand what the asset inventory is, but also present the assets in the right way to tell the story. It actually helps you form your asset story, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think then the step beyond that of the plan on how to make the most of those assets and protect them going forward, and then to be able to communicate that that's something on your agenda.
Excellent. I'm going to go through my questions, see if there's anything else. Can you share examples of companies preparing for a founding round, or a company who worked with you who had got a lot of clarity? Okay, I'll ask again. Can you share examples of companies of managers? Can you share examples of managers who are preparing for presenting to investors and how they use the Intanify?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, being a banker, it's very confidential about all of these things, but then also the way Intanify is set up, this is, company's most important stuff. So we take secrecy to the utmost. But we did publish a case study recently with a company called Orderly, and that was done with Danson's. So that's probably kind of a good one, and it's also public, so I can speak about that. So Orderly is a supply chain analytics AI company. It's got really big clients, including Starbucks and others, and they have relatively big scale. They've mostly been kind of bootstrapped, but they are preparing to do a Series A soon. So we worked with them ready to demonstrate what we call the human plus machine, which is what the job might look like if a lawyer was empowered by Intanify. So what we did with Audley was they went through this process of going through the discovery, which took an hour, and then through the asset identification process. And a report was drafted at that point, so that could have been kind of the end of the story, and would have been a good end because that report, was very well received by the company. Certainly highlighted a bunch of things that they could get on with doing. But in the case study, that was then the starting point for Danson's. And what Danson's did was, instead of having to do, as you described it, mapping, basically collecting a lot of context, is they picked up this report, 30 pages, with a bunch of assets, call it something like 75. That was relatively exhaustive. But then also through those questions that had been asked, things were surfaced. So immediately the conversation, and there's a quote in it on this, was within minutes, was, you patented that, but I really want to understand why you've not done this in this way and why this is know-how. And because of that depth, it was immediately into a very kind of strategic conversation. So what the outcome of that was, and is published in the case study, is Audley does have one patent. Three more, eligible inventions were surfaced through that process, which you may think of what you will of patents. If it is very core to your business, I believe will be very value accretive, but not just value. It'll also protect their position, what's a relatively competitive market. There were what is described as issues in the brand portfolio. So this is a company that's is global, so they operates in a lot of countries, and a lot of moving things around. Because the lawyer was able to see, it's a fairly extensive trademark portfolio, like probably 20 or something trademarks. There were one or two things that were recognized that would have come out in due diligence later, like for sure, but was identified now and could be addressed now. Nothing train smash, but rather fix that on your own terms. And then finally, once trade secrets had been identified by the system, and now you have the list of 10 really secret things that you do that are often in addition to the patents. So it's the processes by which you execute the things that you do, and also things that are nothing to do with the patent at all, but are incredibly valuable to the company's competitive position. It was a relatively natural second step to tying the bow on that and implement a policy, implement some processes and some training. And so they were able to take those three steps, which they are taking, right now, because they'll launch their Series A, at some point this year, of now going to their transaction with more patents, with a cleared up brand portfolio, and with a very robust trade secret policy. Now, proof in the pudding will be on valuation, which more than likely not be public anyway, but I'm very confident that it results in a high valuation because there's more assets, more value, and lower risk. So probably a higher chance for better valuation, and probably a higher chance of execution as well, because there's less that can go wrong in that process.
Well, as a CFO, you probably are well aware more than me that in the end of the day, the CFO typically needs to understand the gap between the book value and the actual multiple used, right?
Yeah.
We don't always have the EBITDA to work with us. So
yeah,
it's obvious that if I have a list of assets and I can say, oh, this is how it's connected to the way I'm going to make money, it's obvious that my valuation is is going to be higher. And I'm not sure we need a valuation expert to do a evaluation for the CFO.
No, no, not at all. And here's the thing: is that the value of a company is always greater than the value of the assets. That's just a definition thing. And if you're an oil company, from that initial example, that has effectively a bunch of steel and leases, that'll be worth 100 million. The company is probably worth 500 million. It's no different with a tech company. And the valuation that you're going to get put on you by an investor that's looking to the future and all the things that might happen is going to end up, if you've got ARR, being a multiple of that, which will be higher than the valuation that we would always come up with.
Absolutely.
What the difference is actually having the attribution of the assets that you have and a number. The number is less instructive than saying most of it lies over here. But then we've also got all of these other bits which are strategically kind of very important. And the valuation itself is not complicated at all. And I'm able to explain it to CFO in 2 minutes. It's the standard method that's done by a lot of expensive professionals. And when they would do it, they would do a whole lot of research. So for them to actually kind of put an expert opinion on it, they would say, well, I've read through all of IBM's licensing deals and the numbers should be more or less this. And, we come into within 20 or 30% of that. What's different with ours is that it's just very transparent, which for that reason makes it more useful to a CFO. It's not a black box number with decimal points. It's actually this is how everything works. And it's always going to be wrong. Every valuation is wrong, but at least it's explainable.
Right. So what would you tell a CFO listening to us and they feel that they have an empty balance sheet but nevertheless they feel that they have something in the company, they know that the company is building something very special, but they feel they need support when talking about numbers and valuation. So basically you tell a company, come use Intanify, put in 1 hour of your time to upload materials, and I'm going to come up with a list of assets that you may not have been aware of. And then let's talk about valuation.
Yeah, that's it. And I would just say, starting off maybe the beginning of my journey, like just don't accept it. Like, because you have an empty balance sheet, because accounting standards are the way they are, that's not a good reason to kind of have one arm behind your back. And whether it is using Intanify or just doing a bit of a hack job yourself, or speaking to paying more money and getting a lawyer, don't accept that. Do go with the list of important assets that you have, and talk about them as assets, even if the accountants might get grumpy about it.
So would you call them non-balance sheet assets? I mean, Intanify helps you understand what your non-balance sheet assets are.
What off balance sheets, you might call it, but look, nobody's accepting that term anyway, because yeah, you know what I mean. So the accountants would be to be an asset. There's these 5 criteria and so on. Now that doesn't mean you can't, we can't call things an asset, because you talk about an asset as an important employee you might have and so on. So I would just call them assets. The only difference is your auditor is not going to allow them on your balance sheet. But as far as I'm concerned, that really doesn't matter. And if you watch financial markets, they pay absolutely zero credence to a lot of accounting. And the beginning of my career as a banker, half my job was frankly to undo what the accountants were doing in all kinds of different ways. So this is nothing more than filling in the blanks of what's not been presented properly.
So you took all your insights of being an investment banker and being a CFO, you understood the gap, and you created a tool to help bridge all this huge gap, really.
Yeah, that's certainly what we're trying to do. But so far, what we've done, and we'll do a lot more, because we've done it in a way that works very well for technology businesses of a certain size. But when we're doing our discovery, the biggest companies, top 5 oil and gas companies, global retailers, were all coming to us knowing that they were missing information. So this is something that is a really big problem and that we will continue to solve in more scale. But that is that's what I set out to do, and what our company has been able to execute so far in a way that we've got to for this point.
Excellent. That's gold. Yeah, I think we have a lot of material. Is there anything we didn't discuss, you think?
No, that's cool. I really liked your questions. I thought they were, I mean, I guess I'll be looking at the same questions you. No, I think that's great. And you know what, it was a really, really good idea to do it this way because I think if I'd shown it to you, I would have led the witness, and that allowed for kind of a more organic and
Yeah, listen,
easily easy digestible.
I'm dying to see a demo, and
Yeah.
I'm thinking out loud about, all the CFOs in the companies that I work with.
Mm,
What's going to happen if I say, even a client that I haven't been started working with, but
mm,
we're talking, saying, come have a call. I mean, look at Intanify. Look, I
mm,
mean, Dylan has
mm,
the experience, has the background. Come see Intanify. I mean,
mm,
I could bring someone to the demo who is a potential client. It's really,
mm.
really interesting. Really
Yeah,
interesting.
cool. Well, we'd love to do that, and maybe we'll do the demo just for you first. Although I'm no problem kind of doing it that way. It is a really gratifying feeling producing that list because when we first did the MVP, we had that expert system, and I saw the questions, and it got to this point that it effectively produced the context, and it was
Wow.
a big kind of it was a big point of friction in our process because it was effectively you spent this hour. Here is we call it the shape of your business, and this is what you need to capture. And now back to you. You need to go and kind of like think that through. And then it was a more recent thing that we've been able to do because LLMs didn't exist when we started this. And there is just a huge amount of power in not just you don't just ask the LLM because you'll get all kinds of answers, but if you have the LLM prompted by an expert system that has got thousands of decision-making rules that are grounding it, it's incredible to see what it comes up with. So we've worked recently with a large, fairly deep tech business. I got five families of patents and work in space and so on. And we crunched for them about 150 documents, and they had no notes. It was like a lot of assets. The only notes they did have promoted some really interesting discussion because it was um, we don't actually own those. And in this case, the attorney kind of knew that business, and they were like, "Sir, you might be getting that from outside, but is it not true that you've integrated that in your process? And by joining those things, it's new in a way." They're like, "Well, yeah." And like, "Well, then you absolutely do have, but maybe it's not that. It's this other thing that's kind of not written down." So we've not been told anything was wrong. The only thing that has come out of it is additional stuff and some quite useful debates. So it's pretty gratifying and it's pretty exciting. And CFOs for sure, but also founders. I mean, founders almost more than anyone because that's your baby, that's all your stuff, right?
Right.
So it's actually and it's founders that feel very strongly about then continuing on the journey because that's what now we see what we need to protect and we see the opportunity. We need to crack on with that. So yeah, both. Cool. Well, let's get time for a demo in the diary, and would love to do that. And look, it
Excellent.
would be. I told you I've got a big affinity with Israel, and obviously Israel is one of the most exciting tech places in the world. I mean, probably per capita the most exciting. So it would be great to have a partner in Israel. I mean, certainly not speaking to anyone else. It would be
Yeah.
awesome to spearhead that with you.
Yeah. I'd love it. I'd love it. I had a cool conversation with someone in Europe about marketing and business development. And, the more I think of it and the more I think of the Israeli ecosystem and what
Mm.
I want to do in 2025, it's really that niche of investment readiness. So I think we
Mm,
have that in common, and uh,
yeah.
really like to explore cooperation too.
Look, I
So
think there's a good trend in that due diligence is really picking up, and I think a lot of after probably good timing because after ZERP and so on, where there was just been money thrown at the wall, investors. It happened with private equity where suddenly you couldn't just slap debt on it. You needed to go and transform the business and add margin and do things. And with
right,
VC now, they actually need to take these things a lot more seriously, and you've seen that with diligence timelines expanding from 3 months to 9 months and so on. So it's all a good thing, but it's also, I think it's good for companies as well. So it's
right.
good for everyone, and hopefully we can do a good job helping companies do that well.
So let me ask you a question. I thought about
Yeah,
it yesterday, and I thought I would ask you. Remember how we met through
yeah,
you
get
know,
out, yeah,
Adam?
yeah.
What happened with him?
So, look, the way I got introduced to Gilad was via a friend of mine who is a owner of a management consulting that specializes in pricing for types of firms like Voluntary Capital. So he was never a potential client.
All
Really,
right.
it was really my friend Carrie saying, Gilad's a great guy. He really knows his stuff. You should have a chat with him.
Oh,
What actually he made some really cool introductions. Obviously, it was great to meet you, but then also some other people. And so yeah, for bigger firms like that, and private equity in particular. I mean, now that's well, I guess we kind of still are on camera, but just to explain that technical point, because I have spoken to a couple of private equity firms, and it's difficult. It's even difficult from a fiduciary perspective for them to acknowledge
mm,
that there's stuff that they kind of don't know about. So in the first instance, before the conversation even starts, you're kind of against the wall like that. But then it is certainly true because I've had kind of more informal conversations with operating partners that they like big firms that have got like 50%